The Last of Us Part 2 blew me away. I liked the first game a fair amount, but wasn't particularly excited for a sequel. That game's laser focus on the relationship between Joel and Ellie, along with its morally ambiguous ending, made me think that a sequel wasn't really necessary. Both of these characters were developed and explored so deeply that any sequel would struggle to replicate or continue that relationship in a meaningful way. Instead of treading on covered ground and caving into the desires of fans, Part 2 tells a far more interesting story that deeply challenges the characters, and by extension, the player. And while I think the game's narrative strikes out in a couple of areas, any story this ambitious inevitably will, the thematic depth, dramatic presentation, and emotional heights present within Naughty Dog's story were incredibly satisfying to me. It isn't exactly a secret at this point that this opinion isn't widespread, however. With pivotal plot elements getting leaked before the game's release, fans have been angry at many of the core decisions made within the story for months now. In this video, I'm not going to rebut every piece of criticism aimed at the game or justify its shortcomings. I'm instead going to explain and contextualize why I thought that this narrative was so compelling, so maybe you can enjoy the game a little bit more. I'm especially going to comment on the game's themes of revenge, grief, and forgiveness, as well as Abby's connection to the player. My interpretation may not be exactly what the writers were intending, but that's the beauty of art. Every interpretation besides mine is wrong, and up first is... The game's entire narrative centers around the decisions of Ellie and Abby, and is even more character-driven than the first game. The story of Joel and Ellie was most certainly focused on developing that relationship, but Ellie's immunity and the potential for a cure was the driving force behind the plot. The consequences for failure were much bigger than those two characters, which is directly contrasted with the overarching narrative found within Part 2. Joel's death at the hands of Abby ignites a fire within both Ellie and Tommy, causing them to go on a murderous rampage in the name of revenge. One of my favorite parts of The Last of Us was seeing the effect that such a harsh world can have on a kid. Ellie's curiosity and playful energy directly contrasted with the world in which she was set in. She was forced to learn skills that kids shouldn't have to learn, and experienced grief as her friends and family all left her in one way or another.
You have no idea what loss is.
Everyone I have cared for has either died or left me.
While the events in that game were largely out of her hands, in Part 2, we see that growing up in such a cruel environment has affected how this character acts, and we experience the negative repercussions of her actions. Instead of doing the mature thing and letting Abby and the WLF go, she goes on a petty mission to get revenge, which will change the lives of exactly nobody in a positive way. It's clear that the adults in her life haven't been good role models either. Tommy, a family man who had settled down after years of surviving with Joel, naively runs off to Seattle without any semblance of a plan. Maria, while opposing the journey to some extent, still enables Ellie and Dina.
I told the stable to let you out with your horse.
Being raised in such a violent setting while not having good guidance is a recipe for disaster, and it's clear from the outset that Ellie isn't making the correct decision here. She makes the exact same mistake that Abby does, but her actions are arguably worse. Instead of just going for Abby, Ellie and Tommy torment and interrogate everyone she's ever cared about. She's causing the exact same pain that Joel's death inflicted on her and us onto Abby, and by making the player feel such strong negative emotions from the jump, we're able to understand the pain that this vengeance creates. The game I was most reminded of while playing was Spec Ops: The Line. In that story, Walker commits numerous atrocities, all while lying to himself that he's truly a hero. He hallucinates about many of the game's events in an attempt to remove all sense of responsibility from himself.
This isn't my fault.
It takes a strong man to deny what's right in front of him. And if the truth is undeniable, you create your own.
Similarly, Ellie tries to justify her senseless cruelty by unfairly dehumanizing and framing her adversaries.
Something keeps bugging me. Why didn't they kill you and Tommy when they had the chance?
I don't know. The one guy, Jordan, kicked my face in.
Yeah, but why do you think that they didn't finish
It doesn't matter.
And while she believes that the WLF are a completely irredeemable terrorist organization, certain people look to them as saviors. The most memorable line from The Line was this:
"Do you feel like a hero yet?"
So I'm going to apply that question to Ellie's campaign, and try to figure out just what she does that is heroic. Was she a hero when she threatened to murder a kid if she didn't get what she wanted? Was she a hero when she brutally tortured Nora by repeatedly slamming a pipe into her skull? Was she a hero when she botched an interrogation attempt and ended up murdering a pregnant woman? Or was she a hero when she slit the throats of hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of people that she didn't even know? Any claim of self-defense goes out the window when you realize that she has absolutely no business being in Seattle to begin with, and her motivation for killing these people isn't in an attempt to protect anything or anyone. At best, she's an anti-hero that deeply cares about her friends. At worst, she's a sociopath committing mass genocide. And on the flip side, the exact same could be said about Abby. She spends years turning her own body into a weapon, and in her hatred, she allows many of the relationships that she could have formed to fall to the wayside.
You guys doing okay? Dating life's good?
Instead of dealing with her father's death in a healthy way, she obsesses over it to the point that her life ceases to have any true meaning.
Abby, when the moon comes
I found Joel's brother. He's at a settlement out in Wyoming.
After getting her revenge, it's clear killing Joel hasn't helped her. She still has nightmares about her father's death, she still has largely dysfunctional relationships with her friends, she still doesn't have her father back. The game isn't justifying Abby's cruelty by making us play as her. It shows that she didn't make the right decision and gives her a way out of a bad mindset. Instead of seeing Abby make the same mistakes that Ellie already has, we see her find something meaningful in life as she begins to understand how being compassionate affects her positively. However, just as Abby starts to turn her life around, the consequence of her sin hits her. One of the most prominent themes in this narrative is the cyclical nature of revenge, where one act of violence leads to another, which leads to another. It takes one side to stand up and act with maturity for it to come to a peaceful end. Joel's act of violence at St. Mary's leads to Abby seeking out Joel, which leads to Ellie seeking out Abby, which leads to Abby seeking out Ellie. This cycle of violence and hatred is manifested within the conflict between the wolves and the Seraphites, but on a much larger scale. The territorial dispute grows into a fully fledged war, with each act of violence being justified by the other side's prior evils. Each faction dehumanizes the other, just as Ellie and Abby do to their enemies, with the Seraphites seeing the WLF as an inherently sinful group, while the wolves view the Scars as a degenerate cult. Neither side is willing to accept responsibility for the conflict and the damage it's caused, and instead shift the blame onto their opponent.
Getting nostalgic about the truce? Easier days, huh?
Too easy. We let our guard down, and they strung up an entire squad.
That was in retaliation to us shooting those kids.
Okay, but those kids attacked our guys.
Isaac's solution is to senselessly commit genocide at the expense of his own people, attempting to end any potential for future conflict.
We could try another truce. How long before some asshole on their side, or our side, unravels the whole thing? No. It has to be all of them.
The battle on the island, beyond the fact that it's a breathtaking spectacle to conclude Abby's campaign, is the culmination of years of both sides failing to reconcile and let go of past grievances. It's the consequence of people making the same mistake that Abby made when she hunted down Joel, the same mistake that Ellie makes in Seattle, and it serves as a reminder for the dangers endgame revenge leads to. It requires the presence of Lev, the only person that Abby has left, to pull her out of this cycle. Abby's relationship with Yara and Lev purposefully mirrors the situation that she found herself in with Joel and Tommy at the beginning of the game. Two pairs of people that Abby has humanized save her life in an act of selflessness. Instead of repeating the decision she made at the beginning of the game, the decision that cost her friends and didn't help with her grief, she does what she can to help the two out. She looks beyond the negative stereotypes she's built up in her mind, and sees these two as actual people worth protecting.
What the hell am I doing? They're fucking Scars.
By caring for Yara and Lev and watching her group turn on her, she begins to understand that building a strong future is more vital to her than continuing this endless conflict.
Why are you helping us?
Lev asked me the same thing. I guess you don't deserve this. But also, I needed to. I had to.
Had Abby not learned anything as a character at all in these 3 days, then she would have killed Dina.
Good.
But the physical representation of her future, and her newfound understanding of how precious that future is, causes her to stop. She chooses to forgive and create new love instead of letting the past once again consume her. The Santa Barbara section sees Ellie learning the same lesson that Abby learned in Seattle. A lot of people seem to think that this epilogue is pointless, as Ellie makes a ton of sacrifices to get her revenge and then doesn't get it, but I completely disagree. Ellie didn't receive any closure from the events in Seattle. Her fight with Abby ended on Abby's terms, and her resolve to return home to help out Dina was made out of compromise instead of conviction.
But she gets to live.
Yeah. Is that okay?
It has to be.
Her dedication to helping her friends over killing her enemies at first shows that she hasn't completely been consumed by her necessity for retribution, but even that falters.
Stay. I can't.
Her obsession and inability to cope with grief leads her to eventually forego the type of life that someone could only pray for in a world this deranged. It's upsetting to see such a beloved character fall to these depths, but without this epilogue, her character wouldn't have experienced any growth. When drowning Abby, Ellie is taken back to the night before Joel gets killed. After roughly 2 years of practically tormenting the guy by refusing to talk to him in any meaningful way, we learn that she was willing to forgive him, attempting to restart their relationship.
I don't think I can ever forgive you for that. But I would like to try.
On top of being an incredibly heartbreaking conclusion to their story, it's likely that Ellie feels a large amount of guilt. In hindsight, she probably wishes that she had forgiven him earlier so that she could have had 2 more meaningful years of life with him. Just as Abby spared Dina and Ellie at the presence of Lev, Ellie spares Abby when envisioning Joel. Just as Lev represents the future that Abby has the potential to experience if she doesn't succumb to her inner demons when in the theater, Ellie's vision of Joel as she's fighting Abby represents the future that Ellie never got. Instead of holding on to her hatred of Abby, just as she did with Joel, she understands that forgiveness and compassion is the only remedy for her grief. This isn't a revenge story like John Wick or Kill Bill, where a character goes through hell and back for the satisfaction of revenge. Killing Abby isn't a heroic or commendable goal. If she had gone through with her intentions and drowned Abby, she would still be just as tormented, and she would have ended the type of loving relationship that was so tragically ripped away from her. Another common criticism I've seen is that the game's attempt to drive this point home undermines what's realistic for the characters. If Ellie is willing to give up her family and kill so many others for revenge, why would she not kill Abby when she has the chance? People aren't always perfectly consistent. Sometimes they don't stick with their motivations when given the chance to act on them. Without getting too deep into this, I know I've acted against my own values before, been tempted to do things that I would go on to later regret. I'm not saying this as an excuse for bad writing, but I don't understand why people expect characters to act like robots. Having integrity is one of the innate struggles with being human, and Ellie being taken over by lust and temptation to eventually be brought back by her understanding of forgiveness was believable to me. Her continual inability to cope with Joel's death leads her to seek answers, and she comes out of that questioning with an incorrect perspective. Deep down, Ellie probably understands that killing Abby isn't going to help her. Instead of seeing this ending as a build-up to nothing, I see it as Ellie saving the only thing she can, herself. On top of losing her family, many of her friends, and her ability to play the guitar, killing Abby right here means that she would have lost her humanity. Although the game's themes largely revolve around the ways that obsessions and hatred can drive even the most likable people to villainy, its larger message on the necessity for forgiveness is more important. Had Abby been forgiving of Joel, she could have experienced a more fulfilling life by growing and connecting with the people close to her. Had Ellie been more forgiving of Joel, she could have had more quality time with him, the time that she so desperately misses after he's gone. If Ellie was more forgiving of Abby, Jesse wouldn't have died, she'd still have Dina and JJ, she'd still be able to play guitar. As such, this ending is far from pointless. It sees our main character come to terms with her suffering and has her be victorious over the game's true antagonist, herself. The reason this story worked so well for me was the way I viewed Abby. A lot of people seem to think that Abby's campaign largely exists to justify her murder of Joel and to make her seem more sympathetic. Instead of seeing this perspective shift as an attempt to say, Abby good, Ellie bad, I saw Abby's campaign as a complement to Ellie's, one that fleshes out the game's themes and provides context for the entire story. While the two stories don't cross over much from a plot perspective, they thematically complement each other incredibly well, and both characters experience very similar arcs at different points. And although the game definitely does try to make you sympathize with Abby, I didn't feel like the game was forcing me to like her, which is why I believe so many players are having a hard time. One of the more interesting ways in which this story is presented is in the dissonance that's created between the characters and the player. For example, by controlling Abby just before she kills Joel, the hatred for her is stoked even further in the player's eyes. On top of killing the beloved character from the first game, she betrays the player's trust. The Last of Us Part 2 pulls tricks like this all over the place. You have to fight the other main character twice, you kill dogs, you have to bash Nora's skull in, you have to go into Santa Barbara and shoot dozens of people you don't know in the face. I think the most divisive element of the story comes down to where people land on this question. Is the story in Part 2 strengthened or weakened by it being a video game, a medium defined by interactivity? Does the player's input make the game's characters and themes more impactful, or does it undermine the story's intention? Some of the most acclaimed films and novels of all time have protagonists that aren't heroic, whose actions aren't justified by any reasonable sense of morality. As an observer, we can separate ourselves from those characters and see the story for what it is. On the other hand, video games have traditionally been used as a form of escapism that allow the player to engage in exciting adventures. RPGs, for example, allow the player to insert themselves into the game. Some games have silent protagonists that act as a link between the game and the player, and other story-focused games will either give the player choices that impact the plot, or have them play as a likable character. The Last of Us Part 2 doesn't follow any of those templates. It forces the player to butt heads with the characters that they're controlling, and doesn't offer them the choice to impart their own sense of morality into the story. Again, like Spec Ops: The Line, the only choice presented to the player is to either play the game or not.
None of this would have happened if you'd just stopped.
I disagreed with Ellie's actions from the jump, but saw the story through as I wanted to see what the game had to offer. And it also cost $60. The initial reaction many players are having to the game's direction is understandable, but it's important to think about why you had that reaction in the first place and what that says about you. By committing in-game atrocities, a player may begin to wrestle with their own perception of morality, and think about the ways in which they justify actions based upon the person doing them. At least I did while playing. Our own connection to people and characters can obscure our ability to analyze their actions in any objective way. Just as Ellie's relationship with Joel obscures her ability to analyze the WLF's actions with any sense of objectivity, our connection to the characters distorts our view of right and wrong. If you favored Ellie over Abby because we've had more time to connect to her character and she's funnier and more likable, then you're dealing with the same issues that the characters in the game are. And isn't that the point of stories to begin with? Stories aren't meant to coddle us and give us everything we want. They're meant to challenge us, teach us things about the human condition or the world at large through the lens of whomever's writing it. As such, I personally see the game's interactivity as an element that strengthens the narrative. Its use of interactivity actively challenges the player by putting them in the same framework as the characters. Playing as Joel in the first game strengthens the bond we feel with him, making his death more impactful. The likability of Ellie, combined with our efforts to protect her in the first game, distorts our ability to see her actions in a fair way. Our hatred of Abby coincides with Ellie's, and our view of standard enemies being disposable goes hand in hand with the dehumanization and disregard for life that both characters exhibit. Certain sequences are also strengthened through interactivity. Ellie's fight with Abby or her confrontation with Nora would have been far less chilling had they been merely shown to us in cutscenes. The first game had perspective shifts as well, and they highlighted how certain characters and events can be interpreted completely differently based only on who you're controlling. The sequel does this same thing on a much larger scale, which works at creating a dissonance that further strengthens the game's themes and forces the player to be introspective. For a story within the interactive medium, that's pretty commendable. As I stated in the beginning of this video though, not everything was a slam dunk in the game's favor for me. I've avoided talking about the game's core mechanics as it doesn't really relate to the focus of this video, but I do think that this game is stretched out for far too long. There are a lot of padded out sections that didn't do anything for the story or characters that I really think could have been cut. For example, on the way to the aquarium, the road falls from underneath Abby after she tries to jump a small gap. This takes her on an entire journey around a boat, just for her to get right back on the road that she fell from. Although the area was cool and there were some interesting notes lying around, in a game that's already this long and that's already had plenty of cool areas to sneak around and explore, this type of filler really should have been cut down. While I don't think that the deaths of Jesse, Manny, and Yara are solely for shock value like others have suggested, I wish more time was spent in the aftermath of those losses. Every death in life doesn't happen for a meaningful reason. And just as the two main characters unceremoniously destroy relationships that they aren't aware of, main characters are needlessly murdered by each other. Just because we don't know about the stories of other characters doesn't mean that they aren't important. But in a game that heavily focuses on grief, not being able to see Dina or Lev really grieve for characters that we know feels rather odd. It could have helped expand the game's message by presenting two characters that differ from Abby and Ellie. I also think focusing on the enemies more could have benefited the game's themes. While enemies being called out by their name after they get shot in the face is a nice touch, I think showing the characters explicitly question their treatment of people that aren't other main characters could have strengthened what the game was going for. The circumstances surrounding Joel's death also could have been altered a tiny bit to clarify how the characters were feeling. A lot of people say that Joel's out of character here as he normally isn't trusting of other people.
He ain't even hurt.
And while that is true, it's clear he's changed a lot over the past 4 years. I think having a quick scene where Joel and Tommy talk about trusting the wolves right before they get betrayed would have helped the audience understand Joel's perspective in only a few seconds. But these faults and missed opportunities were relatively unsubstantial to my experience, given how invested I was in the story and how impactful most of the scenes were. I played the game over the course of about 2 weeks, only at night, and I think this helps with a lot of the pacing and padding issues that some people have with the game. If there's a lesson to get out of this video, it's to try to think beyond a gut reaction. People are justifiably upset at having to try and kill Ellie, myself included. Having to attempt murder on a character that you like is innately uncomfortable, but instead of just being angry, try to understand what the developers were intending with their work. A lot of people are attributing negative intent with the writing behind the story, which isn't a fair way to look at anything. As an example, instead of seeing the deaths of Manny and Jesse as an attempt to show the harsh realities of violence in scenarios that purposefully mirror each other, people will say that these deaths only occur for cheap shock value. It's easy to get upset at an imaginary writer who made every decision with no care or regard for these characters, but that blatantly was not the case with this story. A lot of the moments that many people see as lazily thought out were deliberately made the way they were with a certain goal in mind. People already had opinions about how terrible the game was months before it even came out, based upon often faulty and incomplete information. If you have a negative mindset going into something, it's hard to see anything besides the negative. Trying to look at stories through a different lens can be incredibly rewarding, which was the purpose of this video. The game's ability to tell a deep, yet admittedly hokey message about compassion and love in such a grounded, dark, and violent way is a testament to how great the storytellers at Naughty Dog are, in my opinion. Hopefully I helped you see a different perspective, and if you weren't a fan of the story, maybe you can try to see it in a more positive light. Wait, never mind. Everyone who hates this game is a racist, sexist, misogynistic, incel version xenophobic